So we're starting today with the American Indian Wars, and while some geographically specific battles and slaughters have been given particular names by historians, such as the King Philip's War of 1675 to 1678, which Stenard mentions, that one was also known as Metacom's War, or the First Indian War, which it was not. Wampanoag and Narragansett Indians battle colonial militias in this event, and what happened here, other than the massive carnage that characterized American Indian wars throughout, is that American identity began to really be forged in opposition to an external enemy and without help from an external support. So that King Philip's War did have some hand in the development of the shared American identity. It was an extended campaign, influential in that and a few other ways, and so it gets named, as do a few others. In this class, we'll be approaching the American Indian Wars altogether, of a piece. The years, and some historians would argue with this, the years as we'll be marking them are first contact to the present day. You saw in Stannard many details illustrating this point, but it's worth stating it at the outset that the history of encounter between native tribes and European colonialists, that history of encounter has been a disgrace. The casus belli, listed here, the reason for fighting, was often figured in terms of American exceptionalism or the will of God, was sometimes genuinely defensive in individual or household terms, but really it's clear now and has been for a great long while to anyone who's not blinded by the inclination to understand their own heritage in simply good or unproblematic ways. The casus belli was territorial expansion and domination. A mass genocide was attempted, and in some cases, with some tribes accomplished, so that the colonialists and their inheritors might own and control the land. Before we tie back into some themes introduced in the last unit, and before we look once more at some of America's deeply flawed heroic figures, founders to whom we also turned in the last unit, I want to begin with just a moment on how Native Americans have been integrated, included, co-opted, used in the living myths of America. As a fourth grader in a California public school, I, like many of you, was given the option of building either a mission or an Indian village. This practice fell out of the California standard curriculum in 2017. Still used in many California public schools, but fell out of the official curriculum in 2017. All the projects got set up on tables in the multi-purpose room, missions and native villages intermixed and tacitly visually equalized for our 10-year-old brains. And we'd long been participating in the annual Thanksgiving lessons, handprint turkeys, pilgrim hats, war bonnets made out of construction paper. So this commingling of the native and the colonial was part of the mythic reality that we'd already long imbibed. And it was generally figured as peaceful at that stage of the curriculum. Now in the 6th grade, I aged up to the middle school, at which point my school mascot became the Warriors. And we continue to see that the role of a caricatured, or at the very least decontextualized, native shows up as a mascot for sports. And you see some images of that here, from schools to pro teams. Think famously of the Braves and the Redskins, but there are many others. Only recently has this been questioned by society at large, with large enough groups, making it newsworthy, the question of whether the tomahawk chop is really acceptable, things like this, right? So it's made it into the news, but they remain. So we've got the peaceful coexistence of early natives and colonialists, and with colonial culture and also in the missions. We've got the warrior as emblem for the serious play of sports. And then we've got the wooden Indian, a common character in early television and film, mostly quiet with a simple, childlike kind of wisdom, who speaks when he speaks in a broken English. Think Tonto. Think Johnny Depp's revisioning of Tonto, which does speak to some kind of cultural development. But also think of the actual wooden life-size statues that were once common just inside the entry of general stores, bars, and that can still be found in many restaurants. This, on the left, is pictured in the entryway to the famous Cheers bar and restaurant in Boston. And again, we're talking about the mythos of the dominant American culture over the past centuries. And I strongly encourage, if you're interested in looking for in a more detailed way at the diverse set of myths and mythic, corpuses that are internal to the culture of tribal communities, take a Native American Studies class on oral tradition. That's something that we'll mention here. Encourage you to take that class, but set aside because really we are looking at the development of the dominant American mythos. So we've got this, and in addition to what we've seen so far, we've also got the spiritual Indian. The notion that Native folks have a more authentic, healthy relationship to the land, the community, and the spiritual world. And you can think here of Chief Seattle's storied speech, which is a beautiful piece. If you haven't read it, it's worth it. It's got a complicated and unclear history. One thing that is clear about its history is it was fabricated decades after the fact, clearly not written by Chief Seattle, but used for the last 50 years or so in a long litany of ad campaigns and political movements. And this quote is from that speech: "Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish has been caught will we realize that we cannot eat money." And the speech as a whole stands in, and has been popular because it stands in direct contrast to the governing American mythos of a kind of spiritualized consumerism. But think also of the sweat lodges or the New Age appropriation of Native props and practices. In all of these mythic caricatures, genocide is elided. Complex human cultures are flattened. Anything that can be useful to or supportive of the status quo is appropriated, co-opted. Because the lived experience of Native American tribes doesn't fit into the American myth of freedom, of justice, of universal God-given rights. To aspire to a more perfect union, to hold the truths of human equality to be self-evident while also engaged in a centuries-long project of outright genocide, it's not the kind of conflict that the human psyche can authentically integrate. So the genocide gets closeted, hidden from mental view. Politics, policies, treaties, constrictive laws, they're ignored, relegated to the reservations, kept away from a cultural conscience that might just break under the weight of considering them. Now, Native Americans are the only group in the in America, the only cultural group that has had to have a federal law passed guaranteeing their freedom to religion. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed by Congress in 1978. Also in 1978, forced adoption was made illegal in the Child Protection Act. That means that until 1978, it wasn't just legal, but it was also federally subsidized. The practice of kidnapping Native babies from their mothers and putting them in boarding schools. Native Americans are also the only group who had to have a law passed to keep their dead buried. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990. And some of you will be surprised or shocked or scandalized that it took so long. Then this may just shock you more. The doctrine of discovery was promulgated by Pope Alexander VI in 1493. It applied to the way that colonial European Christian powers stole land during the so-called Age of Discovery, which was the 15th to the 17th centuries. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed its application to the New World in 1792. It inspires the Monroe Doctrine of the 1800s, which granted the U.S. a kind of hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. In 1823, the doctrine of discovery enters U.S. federal law. Chief Justice John Marshall argued that we needed something. We needed a very strong and, blanket law so that European colonialists wouldn't war amongst themselves on and over these newfound lands that were being, stumbled upon regularly at this point. That decision made Native tribes officially in federal law what are called domestic dependent nations. And if you had to guess, here's a question. When would you guess that this 15th century papal law was last cited by the Supreme Court of the United States? Some of you may already know this. That's 2005. In 2005, in an upstate New York, a decision having to do with an upstate New York tribe, the doctrine of discovery was explicitly cited in the decision. The repurchase of tribal lands, it was decided by the court, did not restore sovereignty. So when a tribe sold and then repurchased their lands, they did not regain the sovereignty associated with that land through original treaties. The tribe had to pay property tax. This map right here shows you on the right-hand side of the screen the lands in what is now the United States of America that were tribal traditional lands in 1776. You can see that some have been carved off on the eastern seaboard. You can find this map online, and in an active way it moves, and by 1931, you're looking really hard to find the red spots. So, in another moment of what we might see as grand historical irony, the decidedly Protestant and at times really virulently anti-Catholic new nation uses the Pope's doctrine, a Catholic doctrine, into the 21st century to justify long-established practices of land theft. A couple points from Standard. He talks about Junipero Serra, the early and very celebrated Catholic missionary here in California, down from Mexico and into California. In fact, Pope John Paul II did beatify Junipero Serra in 1988, and Pope Francis canonized him in 2015. He was a missionary, he was an inquisitor, and now he is a saint. And you can see his statue on the left. Many of you who in your public school California educations visited one or another mission will probably recognize this figure, and you can see in the three images on the right some of the many, many examples of statue defacement that have come about since the more complex version of his actual historical presence has become more widely known. Standard also talks about Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, the Supreme Court, Theodore Roosevelt, and others. And the question that I face as I read these profoundly disturbing narratives is this: can we afford morally to recuperate these resources, to employ the founders in our own efforts to establish a more perfect union? And on the flip side, can we afford for the future not to? Is there a way to recuperate the ideals despite the men? To imagine those ideals apart from the men whose lives and actions so thoroughly betrayed them? We'll get to more of what I think on that. I've got a couple quotes though that I'd like to close with, and which were brought together and brought to my attention by artist Judith Lehman, whom you might look up. The first is from poetess Audre Lorde. Think about this in terms of those ideals and legal tools that we established, and heroic figures and mythic attributes and motivational principles that we discussed in the last unit on the Revolutionary War. Think of that as the tools, right? When we say tools, that's what we're talking about here. Audre Lorde says, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So if we use this sort of metaphorically on the question I just asked, can we recuperate these ideals despite the men? This quote from Audre Lorde would suggest no, not effectively, not in a meaningful way. But then turn to Joseph Beuys at the bottom, whom I recommend to you, and really, like, he's got a piece called "I Like America and America Likes Me." He's an interesting figure, and that piece, you should look it up if you have time. But he says something that balances Audre Lorde's sentiment in the quote as it's presented here. He says, "One has to use the tools given to change. You cannot wait for an unguilty tool without blood on it, because life is short. One has to use the tool with blood on it to clean it." So our challenge as citizens, as active participants in a democracy, and also as students in this class, is really to work within ourselves, each one of us, to balance these notions and to figure out how we fit into them and how they might fit into our engagement of the mythic inheritance that we've been born into. I see no easy answer, but I do think that optimism helps a little bit. Hope is worth maintaining, and history can illuminate more for us than social media. Next time we will turn to Tecumseh and some of the more modern manifestations of American Indian warfare.